I'm still in Scotland, and today, of all things, it's been raining. And I'm going to read another section of the book. This is about a small bothy that we acquired in Scotland near Glen Etive. I was driving. We were heading to the Isle of Skye on our first trip to the Highlands. Just beyond King's House Hotel on the A82, we were past a left turning. The view caused Claire to call out, "Stop, look at that." The huge craggy black peak nearest the road led the eye further to a line of receding mountains, one tucked behind the other, like a shuffled and then fanned deck of cards. Each farther peak was lighter shade blue than the one in front of it. We stood by the car in the cool spring air, a light breeze fingering Claire's hair across her face. The sun highlighted pieces of the landscape it wanted us to notice. A small sign said, "Glen Etive." We drove down the single-track road into the giant U-shaped glen and reveled as it revealed itself, not saying a word. Where were we? The road mirrored the curves and the twists of the river on our left. We'd pull over to allow the occasional car to pass on its way out of the glen, or they flicked their lights for us to come and pulled into a pullout. We ran into a cluster of stags munching grass beside the road. We moved carefully past them. The map indicated there was a loch at the bottom, and we passed a scattering of houses, and around one corner a large stone home. We passed a white horse alone in a field, and later we learned his name was Duncan. Near the loch, the road flattened out, and we slowed for a sharp sequence of turns. We saw a small house on a hill overlooking water, and in the road stood geese, some ducks, a few chickens, and there was a sign saying, "Eggs for sale." "Are we dreaming?" Claire asked. Feels like a fairy tale, doesn't it? Well, let's see if the good witch is home. Claire opened the gate and walked up the hill. When she tapped on the red door, a woman dressed in a pleated skirt, a button sweater, and a white shirt with a high round collar answered the knock. She walked down to the car in her practical shoes. The cool spring afternoon didn't bother her, but made us shiver. We stood in the road and talked. She was Elizabeth, and she had spent most of her life in the glen. We had no need for eggs, but we bought some. "How could you ever live in a place like this?" Claire asked. We barely understood her thick reply. I just want. "Are there any homes?" "I can't, there only have 3 homes in Glen." "But who owns them?" She told us the name of the family who owned the whole glen, as well as the next glen over. We thanked her and drove back to the main road under its spell. The following week, I had lunch in London with an older English friend, and I told him about Elizabeth and buying the eggs we hadn't needed. And I asked, how would you ever meet a family like the one that owned the glen? He smiled, interrupting me. "Oh, it's simple. I know them. I went to school with the father." The call came 6 months later. A thick Scottish burr announced that he was the factor, or manager of the glen. There happened to be a bothy available for lease. Would we like to look at it? A what? A bothy. A mal woodman cottage built near the end of it must be all such stone, the roof of slate that. We met Finley at a turnout on the tar road near the bottom of the glen. He pointed across the river at a small white cottage tucked under a huge mountain. We drove down a rutted dirt track to the bothy. In the warm, wet spring weather, the road was covered with frogs leaping, jumping, and celebrating the arrival of their mating season. Claire insisted we inch along. She didn't want to run over any frogs, not even one. She'd say, "Stop!" and jump out to hurry reluctant frogs out of the way. Amazed, the factor arched his eyebrows but said nothing. Inside the small house, to avoid getting wet, we had to duck around streams of water leaking into the rooms. There were more leaks in the roof than the factor originally mentioned. Outside, we could see numerous missing roof slates. Behind the main building was an old ruin, its stone rubble scattered on the ground. Inside, a warren of small rooms were full of neglect, except for the mice. Inches of mouse poop covered the windowsills. The walls and floor smelled of mouse pee and buckled linoleum and rusted window clasps. A dilapidated cooker stood in the corner. The chimney lining sat as a pile of rubble on the hearth. We said we'd take it. The Bothy's solitude was the mirror of our home in Utah, the other half of the coin, isolated, romantic, and set down between wilderness and mountains. Utah was a desert. Glen Etive was a wet desert. The coin's two halves fitted neatly together. The Glen's owners warned us, saying it rains 123 inches a year. But we signed a lease anyway, a lease for 45 years. Claire and I agreed that I'd die first. Claire felt she would live to be a ripe old age, and in her 80s, when the lease ran out, we laughed, believing the landlords would never be so heartless as to throw an old woman out. The renovations took 2 years. At the end, the Bothy reflected our love of wood, beadboard, and antiques. The kitchen table was 9 feet long, a blonde piece of sycamore, 3 inches thick. There were lots of storage space, numerous bookcases, brass window catches, a guest room to the right at the top of the stairs one hoped her children would use. We wallpapered the guest room in brown wrapping paper. We added one window through a 3-foot thick wall above the Belvedere sink. We bought in a cream-colored aga and raised the fireplace hearth to produce a better draft. I brought an old pair of family andirons and a box of ash gathered from the fireplace in Manchester when my mother sold our childhood home. We built up the ruin as a structure in back. Part of it became a sewing room for Claire. The other portion became a guest room with its own wood stove. She stitched a line in the corner of the curtain that closed the bed off from the room. May this thin red thread never be broken. May this thin red thread never be broken. The same word she stitched into the collar of my wedding shirt. At the far left side of the back building was an open shed for wood, tools, and the water pump. We took our water straight off the hill, a long-standing right in Scotland. Into the walls of the ruin were placed stones we collected along the river, where we spent hours combing the river's scree for the heart-shaped rocks. The turbulent river had smoothed the stones we chose. We ventured further into the riverbed when the river ran low, and altogether we gathered 120 heart-shaped rocks. Inside the house, we knocked down walls. We made a big, large room. It was a beautiful Bothy by the time we finished, one worthy to be written about in the world of interiors. We picked out the rugs, the paintings, the clawfoot and ball tub, and the Bothy's location on the far side of the river and left to its own devices feeling created a deeper intimacy for us. Because we would not live there full time, we had window shutters with iron bars to keep the thieves out. The Bothy was a metaphor, a way of expressing our love in the world. We argued about what would go where, and sometimes we argued for the sheer pleasure of it, and sometimes we even disagreed. We hung our gifts to each other on the walls. Claire loved Cecil Collins, a modern English painter, touched by the divine. We bought his paintings. I gave her one of a woman walking into a sunrise. She gave me one of a poet, head in his hands, next to a crumbling wall, as a symbol of what her love had done to my defenses. She had a Winifred Nicholson painting of standing stones. We bought a small landscape by Augustus John. The compliment came. when the world of interiors featured our tiny Bothy as an example of English taste alongside castles and mansions around the world. With the Bothy's resurrection, we were putting in order what mattered most. We found our favorite spot a mile away up the side of Ben Staraf, under a huge old Scotch pine, next to a tributary. The rushing water and the view of the loch and the moss made it a good picnic spot. We often had a candle lit on the kitchen table for friends who were sick or needed support. After an evening meal and washing up, we'd walk across the river around our circuit beside the river. We'd come to the place under the pine tree knoll where we'd turn to each other and confess a sin. Whatever the sin it was, all would be forgiven with a kiss. Once, in the twilight, a pair of light-colored barn owls flew out from underneath the dark bridge over the Etive River. Each owl was the other's mirror image. In their silent flight, their large white wings were loopy as they disappeared into the dark forest without hitting a single twig, passing silently into the darkness. Claire said, "They mate for life." I asked a silly question, not expecting her answer. What word would express indescribable beauty, beyond where all other words fail? She simply said, "Lazaloo." That's the word. She made it up. That night she left a poem on the kitchen table for me to find the next morning. And now it's the new year of January 2022.